Great. Welcome everybody to the Sumo Logic Kubernetes webinar. Just giving everybody a couple seconds here to trickle in, then we'll get started. Great, so welcome all. My name is Duncan Robb. I'm a solutions engineer here with Sumo Logic. On the line with me is my colleague, Alex Klein, who's a senior solutions engineer. He'll be helping out with the Q&A through the session today, as well as assisting at the end, should any additional questions come up. So let's start with a little overview of Sumo Logic for those that might not be too familiar. We were established in 2010 and have deployments across 8 regions, or in 8 regions rather, across 5 continents. So our 2,000 plus customers use the platform to proactively monitor, troubleshoot, and secure their applications and infrastructure. You can easily send any type of log and metric data to Sumo Logic's platform, and they instantly become searchable, dashboardable, and alertable. Sumo enables world-class dev, security, and operations teams to accelerate their release cycles, harden their security posture, and maximize uptime for their customers. So today we'll be walking through how Sumo Logic achieves that in the specific context of Kubernetes. And we'll be taking a DevSecOps approach to that monitoring and troubleshooting. So just a couple housekeeping items before we get into the demo. We will be sending a recording of the webinar after this session sometime in the next 48 hours. If you have any questions over the course of the webinar, you can ask them in the Q&A, and Alex will tackle them as quickly as possible. And then we'll also leave some time at the end, as I mentioned, for a live Q&A, where the two of us will answer any burning questions that you have left over. So my screen is currently shared. So from here, we'll dive right into the demo. I'll be pretty light on slides today for the most part. We're going to try to spend most of our time in the platform, playing around with different aspects of what we support in that Kubernetes context. Obviously, with this being a webinar, we have to touch on at least a couple slides, but we'll keep those to a minimum. In terms of just a general agenda for today, we'll be going through the actual demo and a Kubernetes troubleshooting scenario to begin with. From there, we'll go into how you can use the solution to find an issue, identify the problem, and then drill down to the root cause. We'll touch on our app catalog outside of the context of just Kubernetes, how to search log and metric data, how we actually go about collecting that data, and then we'll kind of end with a second troubleshooting scenario, followed by that Q&A. So in the interest of keeping our focus specifically on the demo today, I don't want to be too distracting up here. I'm going to stop my video for now, and then I'll circle back towards the end and turn that back on. Great. So what you're looking at currently is the Sumo Logic platform, and more specifically, the Explore tab that was built in conjunction with our new dashboarding framework, specifically for this new Kubernetes solution. So if I wanted to navigate to this Explore tab, you can just select our new icon up here, select Explore, and you'll be opened up with this pane. Now I want to mention before we dive too deep into this, that all the content that we'll be discussing, other than some of the custom content building a little bit later, comes right out of the box for this new Kubernetes solution. So this includes EKS on AWS, AKS on Azure, GKE on GCP, or even clusters that you've bootstrapped yourself. So everything that you're seeing comes completely out of the box. On this left panel here, we'll display all the different clusters that we're collecting data from. So in this case, we only have one cluster, obviously, is this production or Prado 1 Travel Logic Info cluster. If I did have multiple clusters, they would all be displayed here as well. What's really nice about this new Explorer view is that it's really easy to navigate the cluster through different entities. So obviously there are namespaces, nodes, deployment, and service views These are all kind of part of that mental model that's inherent in Kubernetes. And sometimes you might want to look at your cluster through some of these different views. So right now we're looking at a namespace view, but if I wanted to take more of an infrastructure-based approach, I could select my node view here. And if I expand this cluster, we can see all of the various nodes we have running in that cluster. I can then navigate to any of the nodes from here. So say maybe I get an alert that one of these nodes is running hot. I can select this node. And now I can see all the pods running in that node. And if I were to drill down to one of these pods, I can also see all of the containers running in each pod. You'll notice that the dashboard on the right also refreshed with data specific to the node that I selected. And this is true of any entities you see on the left list here. So same thing, if I were to navigate to a pod here, we'll refresh this dashboard with a view that's specific to that pod. For this node-specific dashboard, we're presented with both metric and log data that's more specific to that infrastructure approach to monitoring. So just to touch on a few panels here, I can see some high-level metrics about average CPU utilization, memory utilization. I can also see similar information, but trending over time. In this last 15-minute window, I can see any changes to that resource utilization. Moving down here, I can see some system load information, as well as inode details. And again, having this line that helps us understand the trend over time can be really helpful in kind of contextualizing what's going on within my particular cluster. Moving down, I also have some pod stats, the CPU by pod. If I hover over these, we're presented with that metric view as well. So I'll move back up to this cluster level, and I want to pivot my view a little bit, so I'm going to select my namespace view. In this particular view, I'm presented with this cluster overview dashboard that you see on the top here. But I have the ability to pivot to other dashboards for any of these other entities. So I like to think of this navigation on the left as more of a vertical type of navigation, moving down through the logical hierarchy of your cluster. Our various dashboards here, I'd like to conceptualize as more of a horizontal type of navigation where I can move between content for any given entity within this view. So on this cluster overview here, I can see great visualizations of things happening on my cluster level. I can see high-level metrics up top here, some nice honeycomb views of all the pods running in each namespace, and then some other KPIs related to my namespace and pods further down. We'll touch on those in a little bit more detail shortly. From here, in that context of that horizontal type of navigation, I can move over to a different dashboard. So if I select this dashboard dropdown, I'm presented with a number of different options. In this case, I'll just select Cluster Explorer here, and we automatically refresh this new dashboard with that, or from that same entity view that we were on earlier. From here, I can see some more metrics-based information. So I can see average memory and CPU utilization over this last 15-minute window. I can see relative CPU and memory usage by pod for each of these nodes. Moving down here, I can see that same information, but with a little bit more detail. It's worth mentioning as well, all the dashboards that we're looking at right now are expanded out to this 15-minute time window. But if I wanted to, I could select my time window up here and expand this out to look in a little bit wider of a range. As I mentioned, everything that we're seeing right now comes out of the box with this new Kubernetes application. So once you have your data set up and flowing over to Sumo, you add this application to your library, and you can start leveraging this Explorer view to navigate through your cluster with all these dashboards as you're seeing currently without you having to build out any sort of custom content. So let's hop back over to our cluster overview and run through some of the items on this dashboard. Now, I'm personally a big fan of this dashboard. I think it gives a lot of great context into what's happening in my cluster, maybe any strange operations that we're seeing. Up top here, I have some high-level metrics from that cluster level. I can see things like, as an example, for average CPU utilization here, seeing that we're trending around 20% over the course of the last 15 minutes. This may give me some context of wanting to drill into how some of our resources are allocated. Maybe I'm potentially slightly over-provisioned and ultimately overpaying for some aspects of this cluster. So it's a great way to give some contextualized information on things that you can drill into and get some more detailed feedback on in some more granular dashboards. I can see information like errors by namespace here. I can also see top 10 security rules that have been triggered in that last 15-minute window. I didn't touch on it earlier, but you can also turn any of the searches, whether it's metric or log-based, into alerts. I'll run through that flow a little bit later. Just know that any of these items can also be turned into alerts should you have a threshold that you want to monitor. Moving down here, as I mentioned, I can see all the pods running in all my namespaces. Further down, I have namespace stats. So CPU, memory, file system usage by namespace over that 15-minute window. This panel is a great one, terminated and waiting by namespace. Obviously, you don't want to have many pods that are in a terminated or waiting state. It's usually indicative of a bigger issue in that particular namespace. So there's a great way to get some information on maybe a particular namespace that I should start looking into. Further down here, I have some great panels about CPU and memory usage relative to the limits imposed. Obviously, just from a Kubernetes hygiene perspective, you want to impose some limits on those pods. You don't want, that rogue crypto mining operation gaining access to that pod and having access to unlimited resources. So you do want to set those limits, and this is a great way of visualizing your actual usage relative to the limits that you've imposed. Moving down here, I have some node-specific stats for this cluster, all broken down by the various nodes that we're monitoring. And then towards the end here, I have pod stats as well. All these honeycomb views have all this color baked in as well to have a really quick visual reference on what's happening in that particular pod. So now, from here, we'll talk about noticing an issue and drilling into it to figure out what's going on. That first troubleshooting scenario that I mentioned earlier. So up top here, as I started to kind of scroll through the screen, I did note a couple errors here, so a couple issues here, rather. In this errors by namespace pane, I can see my prod loggen namespace has found 6 errors in the last 15 minutes. Moving down to this honeycomb view here, it looks like I have 2 pods that might be in a failed state. So if I hover over this first one here, I can see on the second line here that the pod is related to Carbon Black, my Carbon Black service. And looking at this metric, it looks like it's flapping up and down. So I see it looks like this particular pod is spinning up, spinning right back down, maybe stuck in a crash loop back off or something like that. So I'm going to drill into this to start troubleshooting why this pod is in this failed state. First thing I'm going to do here is select my prod loggen namespace. Obviously, we're refreshed with that new dashboard like I previously mentioned. And now I'm going to start drilling down a little bit more of a granular context to understand what's happening. So for this namespace, we have recognized that there's 2 pods in a failed state. Interestingly, in terms of error by pod, we recognize that there was 6 total on that previous screen. But looking at this visualization here, I'm seeing that it looks like all 6 are related to my PagerDuty pod and not this Carbon Black pod. Hovering over it again, I'm getting that additional context of it flapping on and off here. So I'm just going to drill right into my Carbon Black pod on this left navigation pane here. We'll move down through this dashboard trying to understand what might be happening. So it looks like that pod is indeed stuck in a crash loop back off. For my pod events here, we registered almost 30,000 pod restarts in the last 15 minutes. And it looks like I'm seeing some pod events confirming that back off restarting message. Moving down here in this pod state panel, if I hover over this line, I can get some contextual information on how that state is changing over time. So I see we're in this waiting state here. It looks like this green bar indicates we move into a ready status. If I hover over this red bar here, I see that the pod is subsequently terminated. And then it looks like we move back into this waiting state. Scrolling down here into my resource utilization panel, I see we're trending around 80% utilization. And again, to get that kind of contextual information on what's happening here, it looks like in this memory usage versus limits versus request pod, we're registering some interesting activity. So all these metrics are coming directly from our cluster using our metrics collection strategy, which I'll touch on a little bit later. In this case, this red line right here is the memory limit that we've imposed for this particular pod. And this black line is our working memory. So it looks like every time we start this container up, we spike over that memory limit. Kubernetes recognizes that we've spiked over that limit and immediately terminates the pod. When we try to spin it back up, same situation, which makes sense in terms of how we ended up in that crash loop back off. Moving down here just to confirm, in this terminated containers by reason panel, if I hover over this red bar, I see that the terminated reason was indeed out of memory killed. So at this point, pretty confident that we've just imposed too low of a memory limit on this particular pod. I'm going to go in, I'm going to increase that memory limit, and we should see the issue resolve itself. So just to reiterate, I started on this cluster level up here and recognized the fact that we were having some errors coming from this prod loggen namespace, both from this errors by namespace panel, as well as our little honeycomb view here. Drilling into my namespace, I was able to narrow down where that particular pod had failed, and then jumping into the specific pod here and scrolling through some of these dashboards, I was able to figure out that it was indeed out of memory killed and that our memory limit was too low. Now, it's worth mentioning none of this was done with any kubectl commands. There was nothing that you needed to do in Kubernetes. This entire flow used our pre-built dashboards and our out-of-the-box content. So everything you're seeing from that troubleshooting scenario and that entire flow all comes out of the box with this new Kubernetes app. So without using any of those kubectl commands, we were able to drill into that issue very quickly. So now, this was mostly a metrics-based troubleshooting scenario. We'll touch on a logs-based one a little bit later. But I do want to transition into searching your logs. Obviously, metrics aren't the only component of Kubernetes that you care about. And being able to search for all logs, parse against those, and aggregate as need be is really important as well. So I'm going to navigate to my collection page to start here. And you'll see that I've pre-filtered all of this content down to just the cluster name. So prod01 travellogic.info, which was the same cluster we were looking at in our Explore tab here. One thing that's nice that we recently added is the ability to add custom fields. So I'm going to select Edit here for my collector, and you'll see our fields down here. Now I've tagged this particular cluster with our cluster name. Most metadata is natively connected, or collected rather, through our collection strategy. So cluster name, nodes, pods, all that great information, which we'll touch on later. But if you want to assign some additional tagging, you can absolutely do so. So maybe for an environment variable, I could tag this as production. I could add another field for the team that's responsible for this cluster, or maybe call this DevOps. And it's a great way to be able to search in our log search UI on some other fields that aren't necessarily natively collected from Kubernetes. So from here, I'm going to navigate to a new log search by selecting New and Log Search here. And this opens up our log search UI. So I'll start by entering cluster as a piece of metadata I want to search on, and then I'm going to type in my cluster name here and run this search. Since all my data is tagged with a combination of custom fields and or native Kubernetes metadata, I'm able to filter on these elements really quickly. So I can see things like what container my logs originated from. I can see the source category, which is kind of a way of logically categorizing or organizing your data. I can see what namespace my logs originated from, pod, as well as pod label. So we see a lot of customers that might have pod labels for the version of code that they have deployed. It can be a great way to benchmark the performance of your application before a build and then after a build to understand, between those versions, are you seeing a spike in error rate or anything like that? Obviously, natively collecting this metadata makes it really easy to pivot on these particular items. So from here, I know I have a MongoDB pod running in my environment, so maybe I want to search across that. Because we support wildcarding in our log search UI, I can type this pod metadata field and then add wildcards around Mongo to return any pods that have that particular keyword. And now maybe I want to do some basic analytics here. So in this first message, I see something about sending 34 messages to Sumo successfully as a log. So maybe I want to understand on a more granular level what the average number of messages sent to Sumo from MongoDB is. So I'm going to collapse this JSON file into raw here. And now one of the really nice aspects of Sumo is the ability to parse on the fly. So in our ingestion pipeline, we fully index everything. So you don't have to pre-parse anything. You don't have to write any grok filters. Ultimately, you don't have to predefine the structure of your log messages before they hit Sumo. You can parse in our log search UI, or if you'd like, you can build out what we call field extraction rules, where we'll automatically parse fields upon ingestion. We support a number of different parsing operators. We have JSON, CSV, regular expression. In this particular case, I'm going to use our parse anchor function. So I'll right-click this highlighted section and hit parse selected text. And now I'm just going to select a value to extract. In this case, I'll use the number of messages. Now I'm going to give this a name. Once I hit submit, that entire parse statement is added to our query language. And from here, maybe I want to understand the average number of messages sent over this last 15-minute window. So I'm going to write average, add our messages field here. And if I run this now, in our aggregates tab, we have the average of those messages over the last 15 minutes. One other nice aspect of Sumo is the ability to slice this up into separate time buckets. So in this case, maybe I want to see what that's trended like over the last 15 minutes. So I'm going to break this up into 1-minute buckets using our time slice operator here. And then I'm going to average this by that time slice for that 15-minute window. And if I rerun this now, you'll see a minute-by-minute average of the number of messages sent from that MongoDB pod over Sumo Logic. From here, I can start building out some visualizations as well. So we support line and bar charts, we have pie charts, scatter plots. In this case, I think a line chart is probably the most logical here. Now, once I have a visualization that I'm comfortable with, I'm a fan of, I think maybe some other people on my team might find some value in here. If I want to create some of the custom content that I discussed earlier in the demo and link it to some of our dashboards in the new Kubernetes application, it's really easy from here. So I'll select Add to Dashboard. We will call this, how about MongoDB messages. I'm going to create a new dashboard. We'll call this Duncan's Dandy Dash. I'm going to create this using our new dashboarding framework that I mentioned we created for this Kubernetes app specifically. Once I hit add here, we automatically create this new dashboard, and the visualization we just built is added to it as well. From here, I'll resize this. Once I'm happy with it, maybe in this case, I see this as just a logs-based view. Maybe I also want a quick metrics panel in here as well. So real quick, I'm going to save this dashboard, and then I'm going to select Add Panel here and select one of our many metrics views. We'll keep it easy and do a time series here as well. So anybody on the call that might be familiar with Sumo Logic's metrics interface, this is our new metrics interface. Again, built this specifically for Kubernetes to begin with, but you'll see this being rolled out to other data sources over time. In this case, I'm going to search for my cluster specifically. Because of that native metadata tagging, I'm able to just select the cluster here and then I'll scroll down and pull out the cluster that we were looking at in that Explore tab. And now maybe from a metric standpoint, I don't know exactly what I'm looking for. Maybe I remember that it's memory related. So I can type my memory keyword here. I'll select container memory usage bytes. And the last step here is to aggregate it. So maybe I want to see that average, similar to what we were looking at for that log. And I'm going to average this across my containers. Once I have a chart that I like, maybe for some reason I don't like this color palette, I'll switch it up. Also going to give this a name, call this container mem usage, and then I'll add this to my dashboard. So now in this custom dashboard, I've built both a custom logs view, maybe we did this with some custom map logs or something, and then I have my metrics panel on the right here. The last piece with this dashboard, if I want to add this to this Explorer view that we were in earlier, is to create some stack linking. So this is how I tie this particular custom content to a particular entity level within that Explorer view. In this case, my key will be cluster, since we're doing some kind of cluster overviews here. And for value, I'm going to enter my cluster name and hit apply. And here, I will save this dash. Now, to visualize this new one, I'm going to open a new tab here, select Explore. And from this cluster entity level here, if I hit my dashboard dropdown, you can see we have Duncan's Dandy Dash. So you can see just like that, from either our log search UI or our new metrics interface, I'm able to create some of this custom content, immediately build a dashboard based on that visualization. And then once I stack link it to a particular entity in my cluster, I'm able to navigate to it from that level. So I've been talking for almost half an hour straight now. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. If there's anything that you're thinking of top of mind, feel free to add it to the Q&A. We'll make sure Alex gets to it as quickly as possible, and I'll be back in just a second. Great. So everything we've talked about so far has been specific to Kubernetes. But this new application that we're looking at is just one of the many that we support through Sumo. So our app catalog up here is pre-built content in the form of dashboards, searches, and alerts. The really nice aspect of this app catalog is that you don't need to know the content or the context of what you're looking for in your log messages. It's a great way to get some value out of your logs right away without too much initial setup. So as an example, I'll select my AWS CloudTrail app up here. You can preview dashboards once you're in this app. Our Learn More link here will bring you to our help docs, where you can learn how to collect that data with really specific instructions, as well as a list of all the dashboards that are included and every panel that underlies each dashboard, as well as the value that every panel is intended to give you. From here, it's as simple as hitting Add to Library, pointing it towards a particular data source, and then hit Add to Library here. It's worth mentioning, all the dashboards are customizable once they're added to your library. So you can change the underlying search to change a panel. You can combine panels from different dashboards into one unified view. Really flexible way to start leveraging that data. You can see we support things from all the public cloud providers. So AWS, we've got GCP, as well as Azure here. We have a significant number of different Kubernetes apps. We're currently looking at this one specifically today. We have things for your operating system, compliance and security. It's a great way to harden your security posture really quickly, as well as help you monitor your log data for any adherence to compliance regulations that you might be subject to. Also have items obviously like web server, storage, IT infrastructure, DevOps. So a lot of various apps. We do also have a public GitHub repository, so if you don't see anything in here, there's a chance we might have some content in there as well. I did pull up 2 CloudTrail apps to give you an idea of what these look like out of the box. This is an overview panel that we loaded here. You can see up top here, we're using IP addresses to geolocate all of your users across the globe. And then you can see information like top users, failed logins, and then resource creation and deletion over time. Obviously, an overview panel is going to be that 10,000-foot view. We also have more specific information like console logins. So I can see geolocation again of all those users, logins from multiple IP addresses outside the US, logins without MFA. And as I mentioned, any of these panels can be turned into alerts as well. So take logins from multiple IP addresses. This icon right here will open our log search UI. And then if I wanted to turn this into an alert, I can select Save As here. I'll scroll to the bottom and schedule this search. Maybe we'll have it run every 15 minutes, or you can do real time. And then from here, I just want to pick an alert type. So you can do simple email alerts as well as email reports. We have a native ServiceNow connection, and then can also send a webhook out to anything that can accept one. So think Ops Genie, Slack, HipChat, PagerDuty, that type of thing. It's really flexible alerting as well. So from here, all of these apps are great. The Kubernetes app is great as well, but how does your data actually flow over? I'm going to hop back to our deck over here and move into this nice, shiny data collection architecture model here. So we collect log, event, metric, and security data via FluentBit, FluentD, Prometheus, and Falco. All of these are open source data collectors. They're all maintained by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation as well. So using these open source tools for collection as well as that data enrichment I mentioned is ideal, in part because they receive a ton of community support, and they typically have integrations for any type of data that you might want to collect that's outside of kind of the standards. From here, everything is funneled through a centralized FluentD metadata enrichment pipeline. So not only do we tag container, pod, node, and namespace, but also the service and deployment that all of these data streams came from. This is the piece that's going to allow us to do that cross-signal correlation. So it's going to let you link your logs, metrics, and events to each other. So for every log, metric, and event, you know what container it's from, what pod that container is in, you know all the associated pod labels, what node it's running on, etc. Even better, the entirety of this setup is done via a Helm chart. So it's as simple as running Helm install Sumo Logic. You include an access key and ID, and then we automatically create the collector and all of these sources in Sumo Logic. So I do want to dig into each piece of this data collection real briefly here. For log collection, we're using a FluentBit daemon set that runs on every node in the Kubernetes cluster. This gathers logs and then ships them up to Sumo Logic. From an events perspective here, we use a FluentD deployment that watches the API server for new events and then sends them to Sumo as well. Events are things like maybe a pod was killed because it was out of memory, like we saw in that prior demo. From a metrics collection standpoint here, we integrate with Prometheus, which a lot of you might already be using in your cluster. We collect metrics like CPU, memory, disk, as well as things like kube state metrics, API server metrics, and then etcd metrics. So the main strength of Prometheus is that it has auto discovery that works for both pre-instrumented things in Kubernetes, as well as any custom instrumentation that you might have implemented for your apps. Because of this auto discovery, everything in the Explore tab constantly stays up to date with the live state of your environment. So Prometheus is constantly learning about any new components, and then the Explorer view over here updates with that data as necessary. But Prometheus does have 2 main weaknesses. First, it's not particularly good at scaling. So as your deployment grows, you end up with a lot of multiple Prometheus instances, and that can make cross namespace correlation pretty difficult. And then the second is it was just never built for long-term retention. So using Sumo as the metrics backend solves both of those problems off the bat. You can send all that data right over to Sumo for long-term retention. and then obviously get that single unified view of your entire cluster from that metrics perspective. Lastly here, similar to both logs and metrics collection, there are so many different tools for container level Kubernetes security visibility. These tools generally provide insight into things like behavioral activity to detect some anomalous activity and security events, as well as provide insight into compliance and audit events. So the Stuff Kubernetes app that we were just looking at includes an integration with Falco, which is another open source tool built to detect anomalous activity and those security events in your cluster. It'll pick up items like suspicious job processes that spin up. Once deployed, Falco leverages the kernel module, user space libraries, and Kubernetes audit events to watch for any security events that match one of the conditions in the Falco rule file. One nice aspect here as well is that the Falco rule file not only comes with pre-built and pre-instrumented rules, but you can also build out any custom security rules as well. So if you have a particular item that you want to monitor, you can build that out in the rules file as a custom item. After that, notifications are issued for any matching events and then sent up to Sumo using FluentBit, just like our logs here. Great. So, with this collection architecture, I think the key takeaway here is the ability to do that cross-signal correlation. And part of that is from that consistent tagging that I mentioned in this metadata enrichment. So maybe we saw a pod running hot on CPU. You can drill right into the logs for that, since the metric and the associated logs are both tagged with that same metadata. So I want to move back over to Sumo Logic and highlight that example real quickly here. Close a couple things here. So I'm going to move back up to my cluster overview up here. When I was initially going through kind of our troubleshooting scenario for that carbon black pod, I obviously noticed that it looked like there was an issue with a second pod here. So if I hover over this pod, it appears to be our PagerDuty pod. Now I'm seeing some pretty similar activity to that carbon black pod. It looks like it's flapping on and off. We see it spinning up, spinning back down, likely stuck in a crash loop back off. This behavior looks pretty similar to carbon black. So I'm going to drill right into my PagerDuty pod at the bottom here and see if I can, narrow down to maybe another issue with that memory limit. Scrolling down here for pod state, I see it's pretty similar to the pod state graph that we were seeing for carbon black. But moving down to percent of memory limit, see it's pretty low here. And in this memory usage versus limits panel, I'm seeing that my working memory is pretty far under the memory limit that we've imposed. So at this point, I'm pretty sure that this isn't a metric issue here, that we didn't set too low of a memory limit. So scrolling down, because again, all of these panels are out of the box, as you click through them, we automatically add the filter criteria here. So I did notice as I was hovering over this particular line here, it looks like the terminated reason that we're displaying is error. I don't know if you noticed previously, but on the carbon black pod, that showed a different reason. In this particular case, error is related to my application. So I want to now potentially drill into logs to understand what the root cause could be. Because of that cross-signal correlation, I can take any of these metrics honeycombs like this, click right into it, and from here, I can drill right into my logs. So I have the ability to drill into all logs in this 15-minute window, any log that has this error keyword, or my error signatures. In this case, I'm going to jump right into all my logs and start taking a look for anything that might look a little strange. So scrolling down through here, I see this message here indicating a Java I/O exception, and the message states that it is unable to determine the collector API URL, and we have a status code 401 here. So now, I know it looks like it's unable to authenticate, since 401 means unable to authorize. It looks like this pod is trying to authenticate to the Sumo Logic service. We're getting a 401, and then that pod's getting killed. But I'm interested in why it's unable to authenticate. So if I keep moving down, scanning for other logs of interest, let's see here. So interestingly, it looks like we're logging our access key in Sumo Logic here. So I'm going to collapse this to a raw again. And if I highlight this particular access ID, I can right-click and immediately add this to my query. I'm kind of interested now just because of that authentication issue. Since we have this access ID, I might as well try to search across it and understand maybe are there any other signatures or logs that are going to give us a better idea of root cause. So once I have that highlighted, I can hit add selected text as or. And just to be safe, I'm going to expand my search window out to 60 minutes, pull in some additional data. You know, maybe something happened prior to this 15-minute window that ultimately caused this. And from here, because of all that native metadata tagging, I'm able to start pivoting on a number of different items here. So for source category, I noticed that it looks like we actually have two, which is pretty unique. All of our Kubernetes logs are up top here. This is kind of what we were looking at before. But I do know that we have two logs for, from our internal audit. Those kind of interest me. I'm not necessarily expecting to see those. So I'm going to select that particular source category, take a look at what those two actually return. So in this case, it looks like a member of our SOC team disabled that access key and then subsequently deleted it. So I'm guessing that's the root cause of why we're unable to authenticate to the Sumo Logic service. You know, I don't know why that access key was disabled and deleted. My guess was maybe it was compromised or something like that. From a security perspective, we were shutting that down. But now I know, you know, from a log perspective, that the root cause is the deletion of that access key and ID. So you can see how from a cluster level, it was really easy to identify that there was an issue with one of the pods running in that particular namespace. I drilled down right to that pod to understand what the actual problem might be. We ruled out a similar issue to that carbon black pod. And then I was able to jump right into my logs and pivot on some of that metadata, some items in our field browser here, to really quickly narrow down the source of that issue. So the last thing that I want to touch on is how you actually get up to speed with Sumo. Obviously, it's a pretty robust service. The app catalog is going to get you, 80 to 90% of what you're looking for, but there's always going to be custom content that you want to build out, custom searches, that type of thing. So if you navigate to our little home icon at the top left here, we've got two tabs. So the first would be our Learn tab. Got a lot of quick start videos. We have some quick start guides as well. From here, we have a link to our cheat sheet. This is a list of a significant number of our different aggregators, parsers, that type of information, how to use them. You can drill into more detailed information by selecting the hyperlink. We also have a link to our help doc. And then lastly, on the front of kind of a certification program, we would consider this maybe more structured content. These are webinars and tutorials, as well as access to a Sumo Labs environment. This is going to really kind of build that foundational understanding of Sumo, give you an opportunity to learn a significant number of things in a quick period of time. Each of these is about 45 minutes to an hour. It's how I got up to speed with Sumo when I first started here, and I think they're really helpful. And we do have certification programs that are specific to Kubernetes as well. And then the last piece here, from that Kubernetes front, we've partnered with a number of different third-party providers to create pre-built content as well. So you can see some of our CI/CD providers, DevOps, obviously kind of the hosted Kubernetes services that we were discussing earlier, as well as different security offerings. So we are currently using Falco, but we also have integrations with Twistlock, Stackrock, Aqua, JFrog X-Ray for Artifactory items. So with that, that's kind of the end of the structured piece of the demo. I do want to open it up for questions from here, anything that maybe Alex didn't have a chance to answer. Get my video started again as well. I do want to point out 2 links. You have the ability to sign up for a free trial of Sumo Logic today if you'd like. You can also join us on our Slack channel. We call this the Sumo Dojo. We have existing customers in there that are able to ask questions, get help from our engineering team, talk about items with our sales engineers. So you're more than welcome to start a trial as well as join that Slack channel anytime. So from here, I'll open our Q&A, see what we have. Was there anything that came up in the Q&A that you wanted to address, Alex, before I start going through some of the outstanding items?
I think the only thing that maybe if you want to show again, just how to add an app one more time, and then where if we had multiple clusters, like where you would see those in the Explore tab.
Sure. So from the Explore tab perspective, I'll start on that one first. If you had multiple clusters, they'd each be listed here. So if I had 5 clusters, if I had Prod01, TravelLogic, Info, you'd see that cluster listed here as well. And then you can drill down through that hierarchy exactly like we did with this Prod01 cluster. From an app catalog perspective, we'll take CloudTrail here once again. It's an easy one. So you have access to this app catalog on a Sumo Logic free trial as well as on any paid subscription. So you can search through all of these apps as well, see if there's any pre-built content for this specific data source you're looking at. If you do want to leverage this, you'd select Add to Library. From here, you'd enter the source category, which is one of those pieces of metadata that we append to all of your logs flowing over, and then select Add to Library. This ultimately is just pointing this app to the particular data source. It populates the source category piece of the log search that underlies any given panel.
Yeah, I think pretty much everything else was answered in the chat. If anyone else has any questions, we can hang out for a minute.
Absolutely. All right, so it looks like we do have a couple more questions going over here. Eric, what's the difference between DevSecOps and GitOps? DevSecOps is going to be that unification of developmental, security, and operational data. GitOps, I guess, would be more along the lines of your CI/CD pipeline. I think that's kind of what you were getting at there. So those are all interrelated. Samir asked, how do I enable Sumo for Kubernetes? So what do I tell my DevOps team to take the first step as? As of now, I don't see anything in the Explore tab in Sumo. So the first step would actually be deploying our collection, which is done using that Helm chart that I mentioned earlier. So Helm install Sumo Logic. From there, you would provide the access key and ID as well as any other potential parameters. And then we would deploy this collection. From there, you should see data, metric and log data flowing over into our collection screen here. And then from our app catalog, you kind of have 2 options. So what you need to start with is this Kubernetes app. So from here, you would point this to your event security related data. And then once you have this added to the library, you have the ability to navigate through this Explore tab to kind of drill down into your cluster.
Yeah, I see. Kasi had a question about, are there any exclusive agents that run on pods to collect the logs, or Sumo Logic taps into the cluster to receive the logs? So, Duncan, maybe if you want to just open up the kind of collection diagram real quick.
Yeah.
Just review that. So specifically for logs, we use Fluent Bit, so that just collects everything that's written to standard out, standard error, and then that goes through Fluent D, and then goes to Sumo. So as long as you're writing everything to standard out or standard error with in your Kubernetes cluster, will automatically pick that up and then send it to Sumo. If it's written to another path, though, we can there's kind of ways around that to pick those up as well too.
Great. So it doesn't look like we have many other questions flowing in. Alex and I will stick around for another minute just in case any additional flow in. But as I said, feel free to sign up for a free trial. Give Sumo a try. Feel free to join us on Slack if any additional questions come up as well. We're more than happy to answer any there. And with that, we will end the webinar. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.